Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to kick off this panel. My name is Katrina Armstrong, and I'm the Dean of the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons and Executive Vice President of Health Sciences at Columbia University. And we're here now to talk about a topic that has been dear to my heart for an incredibly long time, which is fundamentally how do we drive innovation to achieve equity, to achieve the greatest benefit for all. I think, as we all know, this topic has started to gain more and more attention over the last years, really for several reasons, I think. So about 5 years ago, and I don't know how many of you saw these studies, data came out that suggested that if we look at men, and I'm going to pick on men here for a second, if we look at men who were born in 1960, and you compare men who were born in the lowest quintile or decile even of socioeconomic status to men who were born at the top quintile or top decile, that historically the gap in life expectancy between those groups had been about maybe 6 years, 5 years of life expectancy. It turns out that since the 1950s, it has now grown to about 13 to 14 years gap in life expectancy. So almost tripled in size over I always say, over the time it was my responsibility, during the time that I've been in medicine. It turns out that that gap, and I always say this when I'm teaching the medical students, Bill and I were just talking about the beauty of teaching the medical students. It turns out that one of the paradoxes, and I say this with all due respect, having been a cancer researcher all my life, is that if we were all to come together in this room and cure cancer, that we would get about 3 years of life expectancy. So if you think of the size, the difference in those gaps, I think that there's caught national attention. And I think if you add that, the experience of the COVID pandemic, the understanding of what it means to have the lived experience of those differences, my sense is there's a new energy, a new sense of opportunity, how across R&D, across healthcare, across every part that we represent, that there's an opportunity to increase our impact by thinking differently about how we do research, how we do clinical trials, how we think about developing medicines and delivering those medicines, how we take on some of the social determinants together. So I am delighted that we have an extraordinary panel here who is going to share their insights into this. I think what I'm going to do, instead of asking you to introduce yourselves right now, is that we're going to go across the panel and ask everybody to share their sense of the importance of health equity. What does it mean to them? How have they come to that work? And I'll ask you as we do this, starting here to my left, BARR, just to introduce yourself and your role as you do that, and then we'll go forward down the panel. I want to say we're going to have plenty of time for questions from the audience, but I look forward to having this discussion with all of you. So do you.
Sure.
Eliav.
Hi. My name is Eliav BARR. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Merck, and I head late-stage development. So health equity, I think, is a really important part of what we do in the company. The previous panel was talking about affordability and access to medicines. But in a company that's really involved in vaccines, as well as in HIV medicines, health equity is a really critical part of our work. And that starts really with understanding how do we study populations who are particularly impacted, whether it's cervical cancer prevention or treatment, whether it's HIV. These are really important elements that start the discussion about health equity, because we want to make sure that we understand how the drug is impacted by the environment in which people are living. And then we have to, through our development program, have to start to entrain individuals who actually speak on behalf of these populations, which is the communities and so on. Absent that community involvement, none of these benefits will actually get to the patient, to many of the populations of patients that actually need it. So we have to really start from the beginning. And for me, that's foundational, not only to understand the public health benefit of our drugs and vaccines, but also to actually make a difference for patients and to improve outcomes. And with that outcomes, as our founder George Merck said, the profits will follow.
Thank you so much. Maha?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Maha RADHAKRISHNAN. I serve as the Chief Medical Officer at Biogen. I'm trained as a physician internist cardiologist, and as you can see, I come from India. And so this already speaks to my not just diverse background, but also my deep interests in really ensuring that we are looking at all patients. For me, impacting the healthcare ecosystem as a whole is of utmost importance. So just like my colleague Eliav said, at Biogen, we focus on neurology, neurodegeneration, immunology. So no matter if you look at MS, SMA, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke, or lupus, it's all about patients. It's all about the value. It's all about how we can meaningfully and measurably really look at patient outcomes. In the earlier panel, we heard the panelists talk about the value. Is what does it mean for a patient to get one therapy versus the other? And how does this translate into something in their own life in terms of value they get from the medications? This forms a large part of what I do and my team does at the company. And I'm really looking forward to this panel. And I have to tell you, I have to thank my panelists in advance and also the Galien Foundation for really putting up this panel.
Thank you, Maha. Bill, what do you think?
Hi, my name is Bill HAIT. I'm the head of Janssen R&D, the pharmaceutical sector of Johnson & Johnson. I've also led global public health in our group, amongst other things. My background, I'm an MD, PhD medical oncologist. Spent most of my life in academics, so talking about medical students with Katrina. So other than an election year, if you do a poll and you ask people what's most important to them, they'll say their health. And in fact, I was involved with a society that did a poll, Gallup-like poll, and asked people, what would you like to see the government fund? Defense research, environmental research, health research. And it was like 80% said health research. And as far as I can tell, people from different socioeconomic classes are just as interested and should have just as great access to good health as all the rest of us. So I think it's just a fundamental right in any country, but certainly a country as wealthy as ours, to ensure that there's health equity.
Thank you. Ariel.
Hi, everyone. Ariel, CEO of H1, which is a technology company. So I share a same beliefs, different perspective to the whole problem at hand. We work with pharma companies, hospital health systems, patients, payers. And so for me, health equity is critical because we see how individuals that come from different low and middle income communities, different racial, ethnic, income, everything you can imagine, do not have the same access to information and providers that look like them. They fundamentally do not trust the medicine that we're creating. They have a history for why they do not. But we want to live in a world where medicine is trusted, and the medicine that we're creating has the same efficacy and safety profile for everyone in the world. And today, we're not there. We saw that in the COVID crisis, lack of trust in the community, trust in our industry. And for us to live in a world where everyone does feel like they have access to healthcare, this is such a critical topic to rebuild that trust that's not currently there and make sure the medicines we're creating have the same efficacy and safety profile for everyone in the world. And so really critical. It's top of mind for everything we do here.
Ariel, I think we'll come back to that topic later, because I think one of the questions that does come up as we take on this journey together is the impact of how do we do this work that truly does build trust, makes patients and communities more interested in taking new medicines, new vaccinations, of course, a critical issue for all of us, particularly for things like pandemics. But, Bill, maybe I'll go back to you then, Maha. Actually, to ask, we've talked about these, this definition, we're going to move forward and thinking about health equity. And I'm curious, as you make that real in your work, how does that actually inform? Like, what definition are you bringing to it? I like we were talking about the idea that in the end, we're thinking about outcomes, but how do you make that work? And I guess I'll ask specifically that one of the pieces of health equity that I think is often important to understand is how it can actually advance our science. Like, how can it make what we do better? Bill, I'll ask you, Maha, and then go for it.
Thank you, Katrina. Well, let me start with one of the fundamental problems that we see, and I think it's seen across not only the industry, but in academic research as well. And that's the ability to engage people from diverse backgrounds in the clinical research process is where the introduction of new and very promising treatments come. And I have absolutely great confidence that we can get there, but it's something that we have to really put our minds to. And the reason I'm so confident is that the diseases that affect the society are basically the same. Obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, cancer. Now, they may present a little bit differently, and they may be diagnosed a little, but they're fundamentally the same. And these are diseases that the industry is extremely interested in as academics. So there's a congruence of need and incentive. Second is that the determinants of accrual to a clinical trial are well known, right? Someone has to be aware of the study. You have to make people aware that there's something going on. Number two is the treatment arm, the experimental arm, has to contain an asset that has the potential to be transformational. And if it's not, forget about it, right? The control arm has to have equipoise. In other words, if you're going to ask someone to volunteer to participate, they have to know that if they're randomly assigned, that they're assigned to something that is going to give them very, very good care. Third, the trials have to be simple. It's like say, as simple as possible, no simpler. And that will definitely relate to the issue of equity in a moment. They have to be accessible, and there has to be very good study sites with good investigators. Now, if those are the known things, you can begin to see where the problems lie, and then you can get to the causes and the solutions. So there's the social determinants. How does someone even hear about a trial? How does someone actually, are they close enough? Are they in a clinical research desert where it's very, very hard for someone to have transportation? Are there cultural differences? I once heard a talk that I'll never forget. African-American leader from the American Cancer Society got up. He stood in front of a group like this, and he said, "Greece is good." And he repeated, he said, "Greece is good." He said, "Where I come from, Greece is good, but I'll bet you that's not always true for where you come from." He said, so the people at those sites have to look like, sound like, and understand the cultures. And then you can't helicopter in and helicopter out.
Right.
You have to be committed in that community so you gain trust. So with all of that, I think that part of the problem is very tractable, and I'm confident if we all put our minds to it, as we're doing, we'll get there.
Bill, I think that's such important points, how we think about being able to really take it apart systematically and work through the process, just like we would any other challenge that we're rising to. I'll also come back, I'm going to put this over here, we'll talk a little more about trust. I also think the geography issues that you brought up, Bill, are really important. How do we truly make these advances trials accessible to people across the country and the globe? Maha, how do you define health equity in your work?
Yeah, I think I was just going to take it further in terms of the geography point. Is start off, first of all, by identifying where these patients are, right? Not all of them live in cities like New York or Boston, where I'm from, but they are in the remotest of places, the rural areas. And so to be able to use technology, to be able to identify those pockets where demographically you have high densities of these population of patients with different conditions that Bill was mentioning. So at Biogen, what we do is we work with claims data. We work with the NMQF. We've developed a tool called the Index, which gives us heat maps of patients with conditions that we have a focus on, which essentially enables us to then go and figure out the areas where these patients are. Do we have enough healthcare providers? Do we have enough clinical trial sites? And the answer is no. So next week, we're actually presenting a poster co-authored with the NMQF, which is the National Minority Quality Forum, that talks to the inequalities in terms of the Medicare beneficiaries, in terms of stroke and TIAs, that there's a complete disconnect between where these potential patients are located for an acute condition like stroke versus actually where the care clinical treatment sites are located. And to me, this is an appalling state. It is the reality, and we need to try and bridge that. And to, again, build on Bill's point, we need to do our best to show we are not going in and out, but we're actually staying in this for the long run. So commitment to me means a lot. Showcasing not just to the patients, but to the caregivers, the families, and the treatment centers. And I say treatment centers, it's not just the physicians, but it's the treatment staff, it's the social workers, it's the pharmacists, it's the whole system that needs to be educated on the cultural nuances, needs to be educated on the potential for this huge lack of trust people from underserved and underrepresented populations come in with, and what do we need to do to bridge those barriers? And then I want to take it one step further. So Bill alluded a lot about randomized controlled clinical studies, and I am completely with him on the points he called out, but I want to talk about the real world evidence generation. So you take a randomized controlled clinical study, which is a very homogeneous, very controlled clinical study, and you bring it to the real world where you're actually trying to use the medications in a heterogeneous patient population, which is actually reflective of each and every one of us in the room here. How do we then take the science and the data and coming from an RCT into a real world? What do those outcomes translate into? What do those measures mean? I don't want to see, and I know in the earlier panel they were talking about p-values. For me, the p-value means nothing unless I see something in terms of an improvement. Is it a functional improvement? Is it a cognitive improvement? Or any other kinds? And this is what a patient needs, right? So for me, health equity, or I call it as health inequity, that needs to be changed to make it as health equity. So to me, it's all about an empowered patient, an empowered family, and again, the previous panel talked about it, giving him the information that will allow them to make the right informed treatment decisions in conjunction, in conversation with the treatment providers.
Thank you so much. And as you were speaking, I was remembering the early days of the COVID pandemic when we were trying to start up trials of so many things. Boston, there was so much going on. We had so many trials we were working on. Yeah. And at the same time, as we started to see the pandemic shift, we started to recognize that most of the trials needed to be done in places that had much less infrastructure, right? The burden of disease was shifting to places. And I remember struggling to figure out how we were going to set up the same infrastructure in the places in the country that were really facing now the greatest burden. Yeah. Ariel, I'll go to you, and then I'll finish with you, Dr. BARR. Ariel, how do you actually operationalize this definition and the work that you do day in, day out?
That's a good question. So I had a magic wand, and I could ask the FDA for anything. It would be the draft guidance that they released in April around diversity and inclusion and representation in clinical trials, to define that as prevalence equals participation. So what's the prevalence of the condition of the disease, and make sure the participation of the individuals in the clinical trial is roughly the same as that. That's what we all want. And so if I had a magic wand, that's what I think is a way to operationalize that in the world. The issue we have with that is we don't have the information to do so. We don't have access to those patients, talking we as an industry, and we will probably have a long way to actually achieve that goal. With H1, we see how pharma companies, when they get a drug approval, the level of sophistication around reaching providers and healthcare professionals, it's unbelievable. Data science, the information, the analytics, it's like otherworldly. It's the most sophisticated marketing engine you can imagine. If you compare that to the technology and the engines of finding diverse patient populations, it's like the Stone Age. A story that we experienced is with the top 10 pharma company, they wanted to make sure they had diverse patients in their clinical study. It was really important to them. And they came to us and said, can you help us do so? Let us know what is the race and ethnicity of the investigators in our clinical trial. We said, we'd love to do that. Sounds like an amazing mission. We said, how do you propose we do that? And they said, go look at pictures. This is a top 10 pharma company compared to when that pharma company commercializes a product. And so I think there's tooling and infrastructure that's needed within our industry to find the patients, as Maha was saying, to use the information, to use technology, and make sure that all the work and the sophistication that's happening on the commercial side of all of our companies happens on the patient recruitment and focus on diversity and representation of the patients in our study. And so for me and for us, it's prevalence of the condition equals the participation in the study, and then that's how we operationalize the world. toward health equity.
Hey, Katrina, could I jump in just
Of course,
to
Bill.
comment? The issue of how good companies are included in getting to those providers to write prescriptions for the new drugs is a very, very important point. And when I joined J&J, my daughter asked me, so how do you like working in industry? And I said, oh, it's a wonderful place. We have a credo, a great culture. It's too bad they have to run it like a business. And the problem, and the reason that you see such sophistication on that end is the incentive. We need to develop similar incentives, not just sticks, but carrots, to get to those people who also need these great drugs.
No, I think, Bill, that's such a lesson for life, right? Even for medical students, I will say. You know, I'll also say, and maybe we'll come back to this if we have a minute, you know, one of the trends that we're seeing across other forms of science is really starting to recognize also the complexity of the labels that we use. And I think this is coming up in genomics a lot, trying to understand. And so I'd be interested as we, you know, as you all are thinking about going to where the puck is going, not where it is now, how do we really plan forward for our ability to truly capture diverse populations? But I'll turn to you, Dr. BARR. How do you operationalize this health equity mission in your work?
Yeah, this has become it continues to become a major focus for us. So we have a unit within our clinical trials operations group whose focus and remit is to ensure diversity in our clinical trials. If I look at our scorecard there, where we do very well is with vaccines and HIV, and where we do less well is in oncology. And so, you know, you have to ask yourself what lessons can you learn from that. In the HIV space, what we tried to do is, you know, we had a little bit of a lull in our pipeline, but we start to thought a little bit about why, you know, what we can do differently. And, you know, frankly, if I looked at all the people that we were talking to, they were all very, very plugged into fairly well-off gay men in the big cities who, you know, to be frank, have had the brunt of the pandemic or the epidemic before, but now, thankfully, through the work of a lot of very important companies, and we've been able to improve their outcomes. But you know, the disease is a disease of poverty now. It's the same as the disease as cervical cancer, where we've been working on for years now with Gardasil, and so, you know, we took a very long-term approach as our drugs were in early development and said, let's just recast completely who's the community we interact with. And that meant that we, you know, I myself and others, we spent a lot of time in the South and a lot of time talking to folks in clinical sites where we don't actually hadn't done much clinical trials. And so it was that focus and that attention that helped us a lot. And so women in trials, African American in trials, Americans in trials increased dramatically in this Laboratories program. In cancer, it's a lot more difficult. It's just been a much harder nut to crack. And part of it has to do with all of the determinants that Bill talked about, which is, you know, are you diagnosed on time? Are you in a research desert? Do you understand what the clinical trial is? Does your doctor understand what the options are that she or he might be able to provide to you? And so there we're working very hard to try to actually establish clinical sites in large catchment hospitals that actually don't do very many trials, but have enormous patient populations. You know, we always talk about going to low and middle income countries and helping them out. My mission for the team has been, there is so much unfairness and inequity in the United States. Let's do that at home. I am sure that we can create the same kind of benefits that we would otherwise do.
Dr. BARR, I couldn't agree more. I think if we just think about cancer for a minute, one of the striking things, I'm sure you all have seen this map of where, and I think this is always never in my interest to point it out, because most of the cancer centers are going to be concentrated in really Northeast, to some degree on the West Coast. You look at the whole middle part of the country, and I will now confess that I grew up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And you look at that whole middle part of the country, that you're really, the opportunities and the access, the distance is just extraordinary. And then, you know, I've wondered, and Bill, maybe I'll come back to ask you this, maybe we'll even go around and comment on this, because Dr. Barr, as you were talking, I raised this question of, you know, what are the differences as we look at these different diseases and our ability to do this? And obviously, the genomics revolution, precision medicine, has now become such a driver for some of these areas. And access to those services is so variable as we go across. And so I'm kind of curious, as you all think about building platforms to actually bring patients in addition to the trial sites, are there other things we need to be thinking about that need to really become accessible for patients to be able to do this? Maha, I'll start with you. And obviously social determinants come up, but I'm also interested in the science and the clinical care.
Yeah, so I think it's a fantastic question. I think, let me take the example of lupus, for example, right? It's a great example of where you see a disproportionate number of people of color getting lupus, either SLE or CLE. So obviously we have a significant focus on lupus as a company. We have programs ongoing, but it's not easy, I'll tell you. It's been a challenge to really identify those pockets where these patients are, because the first is diagnosis. It's a lack of diagnosis. It's a lack of timely diagnosis, and I say that for a reason, before complications set in, right? You do not want them going on to progressive other complications, renal, cardiac, neuro, whatever. So what we have been doing is essentially working with obviously NMQF, Latinx communities, and also identifying pockets where these patients are, developing specific educational materials to make the patients and their families aware of the options. I think lack of information could be the biggest barrier for uptake. So essentially in Spanish, in languages that are easily spoken by these patients and communities is what we are doing. Secondly, we are also partnering right in our backyard in Boston Medical Center, which has a very high number of underserved and underrepresented populations being treated, and obviously a large contingent of patients with lupus. So working there as well. And in addition, what we also do is we have, again, working with the NMQF. We do a lot of work with them because we feel that they are really leaders in terms of championing this health equity aspect, is we have worked with them on a project called a CEOr, Clinical Trial Learning Centers. So what it essentially does is to go to the clinical sites and train them to do trials that are focused on health equity. DE&I is a core focus of what they do. We've also put together a standing advisory board, not just in lupus, but across the areas of focus, where we have physicians from all different therapeutic areas meeting with us, giving us guidance on how we design studies, how we design educational interventions, and also how do we essentially gather real-world evidence and information. So we take all those insights and constantly integrate them. And as Eliav mentioned, we are also putting up dashboards now. Because it's one thing to talk the talk, but we need to walk the talk as well. And so to be able to clearly see on a quarterly basis, monthly basis, and tracking it and seeing how are we doing against our goals. So Alzheimer's, for example, the study, lecanemab that we are partnering on with ASI in Alzheimer's had 25% of patients of African American or Latin origin. Fantastic, because it very much matches up with the Medicare population. But that's not done. We've got to keep doing it more, right? So when we are doing our post-marketing requirement study for Aduhelm that was approved as the first medication through the accelerated approval pathway, we have set a goal for ourselves to go as high as 18%. We know it's not easy, but we know it's doable. And we need all of us to be working together, which is why, industry coming together with academia along with technology. And you mentioned, we need the CMS, we need the FDA, we need the NIH, we need all of us working together here on this topic.
Thanks so much, Maha. So Bill, I'm curious, in the cancer space, it seems like a good part of what you're going to need to drive this forward is actually people to have access to good diagnostics, genetics, other things across the country or maybe the globe. How do you see that fundamental access issue for your business?
Yeah, well, I think it's absolutely essential. And I want to call out one of the initiatives that was really taken by my colleagues at Bristol Myers Squibb, along with Roy Herbst at Yale and the ACR, American Association for Cancer Research, they put aside several $100 million to train clinical researchers from diverse backgrounds. And I think that's such an important first step, because the goal, of course, that a certain percentage of these well-trained people will go back into their communities, and that will be to get at the issue of these clinical research deserts and people who actually understand and communicate because they come from a similar cultural background. I think that was just a great initiative, and I think it's the one of many, many things that we can and should do.
Yeah, that's such an important bill. One of the things that I think we've known for some time is that healthcare, like many things in our country, is just immensely segregated. So if you look at, I think we've studied it in primary care, we've studied it in oncology. If you take people of color, that they tend to be clustered within certain providers, certain hospitals. And so, Bill, I think the opportunity to have those places get trained to develop faculty and leaders is so critical.
When there's a really good clinical investigator and a team at a site, we go there. You know, that's where we want to go. So I think that's a terrific initiative.
And one of the things that's been very interesting for us is that we have a lot of meetings with cancer centers during the course of the various conventions, ASCO, ESMO, et cetera. And so we had a meeting with MD Anderson, and they said, well, we want to collaborate more. And we asked them, well, we'd love to increase diversity in clinical trials. And what was interesting for them, they said, well, we've got our, mega spaceship hospital here, and if you go 7 or 8 miles, there is the LBJ hospital in downtown Houston. And there's not much clinical trials going on there. And so I said, well, what Merck would like to do is, and we don't want to have our name on it, we want to just give you the resources, is to go and is to train that, and to let's see if we can try that paradigm, because there's Emory and Grady, there's a variety of different places, Cook County Hospital and so on, where these research deserts are there, the patient population is there. And it's this, you don't even have to go to the rural areas, right? I mean, it's even in the heart of the cities as well. So we're doing that. One other point that I think that's been both heartening and scary for me has been that our data monitoring committees have been really on our backsides they look, and now we get a lot of feedback from, we've got 300 phase 3 cancer trials in various stages, and they look at our numbers and they say, where are the patients? What's the diversity ratio there? So I think those are really good incentives for us as well.
I'll come to you, but I just want to echo one thing you said. One of the also remarkable things as you think about investing in clinical trials in these sites is that we've learned that by investing in some of these advanced clinical trials, you're going to elevate the entire care cycle in those areas. And so it becomes this virtuous cycle that as industry invests in those institutions, it elevates the care. You're able to then bring more patients to trials, to grow more investigators. And I think that positive feedback loop is really extraordinary in my experience. So Ariel, tell us what you're thinking about.
Yeah, these are great incentives, by the way. So what Bill mentioned before around incentives. You see some sticks where if you don't have a certain patient population, your label is going to be minimized. It's a stick. But our reimbursement bodies can add a carrot in making sure that the label reaches all patient populations and they reimburse them. So it's a great carrot there. I think what we're hearing from the panel, which we're seeing around the industry as well, is there's not many carrots and sticks yet operationalized throughout the ecosystem. And the ethics and the morality of these organizations are starting first, followed by what we're going to see, which is reimbursement bodies following, regulatory bodies following that. In terms of operationalizing it as well as, and we didn't talk much about it, but it's critical to accessing these patients to these decentralized clinical studies and making sure for certain indications where it's possible to do so, and the study and criteria and the protocol fit it, is reaching these patients without needing to spin up a new study center, spin up a new hospital, but reaching them where they are, at the pharmacy, in rural populations, at their home, is another key way that we're seeing being able to reach these patient populations.
I think that's such a great point. I think one of my favorite studies from a very long time ago looked at people's adherence to diabetes medications. And out of a number of things they studied, all of the things that we try to do, the most important predictor was whether they knew the name of their pharmacist. And so you just think about these connections that we can build in communities. And I think back to the point, Bill, you, Maha, and everybody made about the long-term commitment that you make when you're doing these efforts. Well, I think we'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for some questions from the audience here. I know that we're all in many ways committed to this journey, but it's a hard journey. It couldn't be more important, but I'm sure there are many challenges on people's mind. I want to come back to this idea that I think, Ariel, maybe you hinted at first about the issues of how our behavior, how what we're doing now really can take on this challenge of building trust in science, building trust in research. You know, I will say one of the beauties of, I joined the Vagelos College about 7 months ago, and one of the extraordinary things of the benefits of that has been getting to work with Dr. Vagelos and see just how we have, under his leadership, created a culture with the medical students, who some of you got to see last night, of really fundamentally bringing equity and social forces to the front, both because of advancing science that way, but because of the commitment to how that actually creates a social good and sets a standard, I think, for trust and behavior. And so I think we all know, coming out of the COVID pandemic, although it's certainly not new, that many people would argue some of the greatest barriers to the impact of any new medicine are just going to be getting it to the people who could benefit from it. And so I guess I'm curious, maybe I'll start with you, Bill, as you think about forward, and we talked a little bit about the importance of doing high quality trials. How do you think about what we can do as an industry in innovation that really can address this concern about science and research?
You know, Katrina, earlier you raised this sort of interesting point about where the puck is going. And everyone would like to know that, and how what we could do to get our students and people aligned to where that will be. I'm going to take a slightly different tact and say, here's where I think the puck should go.
Excellent.
And I think that and it was really proven out in some ways with COVID. We spend an enormous amount of time and energy developing and teaching students, developing drugs that treat very difficult diseases, often at the end of that disease course. Personally, I think it has to be done. The patients are waiting, but we spend much less time in preventing and intercepting a disease-causing process, or the prototype, of course, was the statins. And then we get to COVID, and I never met anyone who said to me, you know, hey, Bill, I really would like to get COVID so we can get a drug. Everyone says, how do we get the vaccines? Right? So I really think that we should be thinking hard about pushing the puck toward prevention, interception, early diagnosis, understanding the disease-causing processes like we did with cardiovascular, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and intercept the process. And if we can do that, people, I always thought about the single moms who came to see me who developed cancer. Their life was a mess. And we developed a cancer center in New Jersey. Everyone said you shouldn't do that because people could just go to New York. But I thought about these women. They're going to go to New York every week. I mean, what are you talking about? And of course, the cancer center blossomed because of that. So I really would, and just imagine, and these people would say, I never smoked, I never drank, none of my family has cancer. What could I have done differently? And the answer is, quite frankly, I don't know. But I think we can know. We put our minds to it.
Bill, I think that's such an important message. And I think also just emphasizing kind of what you were saying before, that, building in a commitment to a community and really understanding the people's experiences in that community can just be so important to trying to really create that trust and make that work moving forward. Dr. Barr, I'll turn to you. Like, as you think about it, and I love the idea that you're investing in these communities, sites that really, I think, have so long been overlooked. What else do you think of as we're trying to take this on as a scientific enterprise to really ensure our discoveries have the greatest impact?
Well, I think, so first of all, it's also the choice of the disease that you're going to be working on, okay? There's a lot of stuff that, we spend a lot of money on that's really narrowly focused. And so, I think that's one thing. But really, for me, it's about a long-term commitment. I'll give you an example with Gardasil and Gardasil 9, this is cervical cancer prevention. We've been at it now for 30 years since the clinical trials started. And when we did the clinical trials, we really focused our attention on building community centers in many of the places where the rates of HPV were the highest. And actually, that turned out to be an enormous benefit. And to be fair, many of these were ex-US and in Peru and Brazil and so on. But these places have thrived and actually have developed now into their own community centers. So one of the things we need to do is to be able to not just helicopter in, as we were talking about before, but understand that the places where we're going to develop clinical trials will be also the implementation leaders for a new intervention. And so, as we've built out Gardasil, those centers became hubs that then trained other people, and then trained other people again. And so, I think it's really important to have that long-term commitment, even though the pipeline may not necessarily mean, I've got a new hot drug now, but to continue to build the body of evidence in those centers and to continue to hone their ability to address not just phase 3 trials, but then effectiveness demonstrations, long-term outcomes, address questions about, will this change fertility? Will this change my, does it cause long-term sequelae and so on? And having that long-term presence also engenders long-term trust in the results. I can be very passionate about, our safety and efficacy database, but it's much more effective in many communities if the local leader, especially this is the place where you get your kids vaccinated and so on, says this is good for my community. And so that's why we've continued to build research and continue to invest in research in Gardasil so that we can continue to enable the community to feel comfortable about it.
And I'll just emphasize that, one of the fascinating paradoxes in some ways of the COVID-19 vaccination efforts. So I've spent some time working in Native American communities in the Lakotas. I think, as we all may be aware, that some of the highest early rates of vaccination were actually in some of the Native American communities. And I think, to your point, a lot of us, because the local leadership really engaged in it, stood up, advocated. And so I think that local commitment, and your commitment to building it. The other thing I'll say that I've noticed is that as one of the striking statistics that I just heard, actually, from Sanjay Gupta, believe it or not, who was talking about this issue of trust, is that only about 20% of Americans, and I'm never sure how to define that, but let's say 20% of Americans say they've ever met a scientist.
I've heard
Wow.
And so I think, one of the other realities is we talk about this distribution of people across the country and the commitments, and also how we as scientists think about our roles in societies. I think it's just recognizing that those connections mean so much to young people thinking about science, to any of the rest that we do that. I'm going to finish with you, but I'm going to go to Ariel next. So Ariel, I would love to hear your thoughts about this journey to really ensure that our research has the greatest impact, build trust. How would you do it?
Yeah, so if we talk about COVID vaccine, there was no questions around the efficacy and safety of the vaccine. The questions was, is there a bug in it that's going to track me for the rest of my life? Or is George W. Bush following me? And the lack of trust, which could be true. Bill could tell us. But the lack of trust is so paramount. And it goes to what Eliav was saying. And we talk to patients and we work with patients. The providers that they're engaging with in low and middle income communities, they're not the ones that are running your clinical trials. They're not the ones that are the principal investigators in your clinical trials. And they're not as informed and aware of the research, the latest therapies. And the power of storytelling with local community leaders is so paramount. And our investment into these communities, into providers that are reaching patients from low and middle income communities that do not have the same access and the same education and the same information that ones at MD Anderson do, or Mount Sinai. It's completely different. And so that continued investment for the long term, focusing on providers that see patients from different backgrounds than the ones that we're normally reaching, making sure we're educating them, investing the same into them. And what you'll get in the long term is access and people wanting to use the therapy once it's approved, if you're engaging those providers upfront in the process. And so that's where I think trust needs to be built. And it's what we all want, ultimately. We go into this business not to make money. We go into this business to help people. And you're going to make money. I forgot the quote that Eliav said at the start. It's profits follow the science, which is true, but profits also follow trust. You have great science, nobody trusts the medicine, they won't use it, you don't make any money at the end of the day. And so investing early in those communities that don't generally get our attention, those providers that don't get our attention, will ultimately lead to the outcomes that we want, which is people using the medicine that we believe is safe, efficacious, and will lead to healthier lives. And so it's so critical, and I think it's starting early and investing in the long term.
And I'll just echo, I mean, one of the data points that we've seen is that if you look across the US, and in fact, probably across the globe, and you measure trust in most institutions, let's say since the 1950s, you can measure it in lots of different ways, but often there's something called the General Social Survey that's done every couple of years. You can measure those numbers and trust in pretty much everything. As much as saying, maybe what isn't lost on anybody who reads the news daily, but let's say trust. But paradoxically, trust that patients have in their primary doctor and their personal doctor stays at this level throughout it. Now that may be because they're smart enough that if they don't trust the doctor, you change. So I want to be careful, which it's not as easy to change your government. But it turns out that that magic of that individual relationship, I think, is such a powerful thing. I totally agree, Ariel. And how do we use that for the force of good then? Maha, what do you think about how we can do this to build trust?
I think we have to be bold, we have to be fearless, and we have to say that we are going to go beyond our comfort zones, because we are all creatures of comfort. And we have to look at this in a completely different way. We have to start with really talking about the journey of the patient, so the patient journey. Really trying to understand the different steps a patient goes through when it comes to these underrepresented, underserved populations, which is very different from the patient journey that many of us in this room would be going through. To be able to characterize that, but to also educate people on the nuances is important. The other thing that I talk to my colleagues in R&D in the company, and many of which are in the audience here, is the disease trajectory is changing in patients who have been treated, diagnosed and treated. But it still remains the same in patients who have not been diagnosed and who have not been treated. So we need to appreciate the fact that a condition like MS, where people used to come in with wheelchairs before, and you don't see as many wheelchairs, doesn't mean that if you go into a rural part of the country, you will not see wheelchairs. The same applies to SMA. We are an SMA, and we say that we are actually able to make babies sit and walk. Is that the case with every newborn that has the SMA as a condition? The answer is no. So we need to really put that lens of needing to think differently, needing to be bold, needing to be fearless, and accept the fact that we may not have done things right all along, but now is the time to fix it. And now is the time for us to really think about DE&I, health inequity, to make it health equity in a completely different way. And I tell people we are very blessed to have the life we have, which I mean each and every one of us. So let's do our best to give back. And let's do our best to really do something that will be meaningful for the patients we truly mean to serve.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have a few minutes for any questions from the audience. I'm looking to see if anybody is, yes, please. I don't know if we're asking people to use a microphone. In general, we do. So they will bring you a microphone.
I love the outfit.
Thank you.
If you could just introduce yourself.
My name is Wilfred Njagi. I run a business incubator out of Kenya, Nairobi, called
Wonderful.
Vagelos Africa. Wow. So I flew a 20-hour flight to this. And as much as this is a US pre-Galien, allow me to pitch in for low and income countries as we are speaking about equity and inclusion. Because I think inequity is highest the farther you go into the developing nations. I know there is enough inclusion issues even in the US, but the farther you go out to Africa, Asia, the more inequality you're going to experience there. And what we've learned also is that if you were to do a trial in a place like East Africa, not only do you get the diversity, because we have the largest genetic diversity, I think, in the globe, because we have all the different origins there, but then it's also very affordable because we don't have as much access, right? So patient recruitment in low-income countries tends to be even more affordable, to the contrary of what most may think. And we've been speaking to some of European-based pharma companies, and what we've learned is that a lot of trials were being done in East Europe because it's cheaper there. But now with the issue in Ukraine, they are thinking Africa is the next frontier, is the next fertile ground to do these trials. So I said I must pitch in for low-income countries. I don't know if any of the panelists here are thinking of trying to do some of the trials in developing countries. One success we have in the med tech sector, one company we're involved with to make a low-cost bubble CPAP that doesn't use electricity. We got an amazing success story where that device was shipped back to Europe. When hospitals were being bombed in Ukraine, this device, which doesn't use electricity, made and manufactured in Kenya, for the first time was being shipped to be used in Europe. So there's cases for reverse transfer of innovation, which if we want to do more of that, then we have to do more trials. Encourage you to, it might look like out of the norm, but with partners like Vagelos Africa is doable. And I don't know any of the panelists is thinking low-income countries. And we're there, we are launching a CRO and a biobank in Nairobi that can help you do that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, why don't we ask people to comment on how you think about those efforts? We'll just go
I think,
down the list.
yeah, of course, low and middle income countries are important places to do clinical trials. And, you know, we also have a special obligation there. You know, first of all, this is a place where there's been a lot of ethical challenges, both in terms of over incentives for the patients, but also the pharma companies' prior histories. On the other hand, there has been, what's been interesting in Africa is the regulatory environment has changed and improved quite a bit. And so I think that there's more opportunity to sort of normalize the way in which we interact in a clinical trial setting. We've traditionally been mostly in South Africa, which obviously everyone is. But you're absolutely right that East Africa has become a very important part of our future. And you know, in order to do that, this is not going to be, it's very important not to be to do this in a way that's opportunistic. This really does have to be a partnership, and this is especially true in cancer, where you know, you bring an innovation like Keytruda, it might sound really great, but you know, there's all the work that needs to be done to get people to the hospital. They need their PD-L1 testing and all that. And so one can't just say, oh, well, you know, we'll do our trials and off we go to bring those data to FDA. That's not what we need to do. So we have to, that requires that commitment, and I agree with you that there is incredible opportunity on a global basis for that kind of interaction.
No, I completely agree with Eliav. I think in the areas that we operate it requires a lot of complex infrastructure. in addition to the regulatory considerations, et cetera. So imagine that even in this country, we don't have places where there's a cyclotron where a PET ligand can be manufactured. So to bring a study in Alzheimer's to any other country, for example, in East Africa, where there are no cyclotrons, no MRI imaging places, no scanners, would be doing injustice, because then you would be setting false expectations. And also the other point is, you don't go into a country just because you think there's been no trials done, so let's go get, because you can get patients faster. That's an ethical dilemma, right? So you want to go to a place where there is prevalence and incidence, epidemiology, data that supports the fact that you could run a study there, but then the infrastructure, the training of the physicians and the treatment teams. So what you're saying is very valid. This is all work in progress, but are we going to see the change transformation happen tomorrow? I would say it's going to take some time.
Great points. Bill, what do you think?
First of all, I think great corporations have a responsibility to ensure as best we can that the drugs that we've developed gain access to low and middle income countries. And I think, like so many things, the model for how to do this right began with Roy at Merck. I refer you to the classic text, Merck Miracles or something like that, where ivermectin would not have been necessarily a big commercial success in the US or in mature markets, but the scientists at Merck realized that perhaps a single dose of this could cure river blindness in kids in Africa. And so Merck took the next step and set up the system to get that drug approved and ultimately access in Africa. We've taken on a similar model in global public health at J&J, where we said, well, what are the drugs in our pipeline that could follow that sort of ivermectin model? So we began with a deworming agent called Vermox, and we're delivering about 1 billion doses a year of Vermox to low and middle income countries. It's basically we manufacture it and then we hand it off. Second is we developed a drug for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis called bedaquiline. Bedaquiline is not a big commercial drug in the US or in developed countries, but it's absolutely critical in lower middle income countries. So we found the way to gain access to bedaquiline for TB. And finally, bedaquiline has this remarkable ability to kill Mycobacterium lepra. So people that don't realize there's about 200,000 new cases of leprosy a year. And so we're very excited that someone once cured leprosy in biblical times, hopefully also starting with J, but 2 J's. J&J will cure leprosy in modern times.
That's a good one.
Last but not least, it's very complicated. It's complicated to get a drug on the market in low and middle income countries because you have to go through several different types of steps. There has to be a World Health Organization review and approval, and the access is complicated. So you have to be in there, understand it, and invest in it, and the payoff, not in dollars and cents, but in how it makes you feel, is just fantastic.
Yeah, Bill, I'll just say, and then I'll turn to our front row here. You know, one of the things we are giving out, and I was sharing with Ken Frazier last night, I said all graduating students at the Vagelos College get a T-shirt that says, "What would Roy do?" And that's what they wear for the rest of their careers. And if they can just look down and remember it, I know we're in a good place. Please, you could introduce yourself.
Kimberly Smith from Vive Healthcare. So I wanted to follow up on the trust discussion, particularly as it relates to African Americans. There has for a long time been a cop-out that African Americans won't participate because of mistrust. But the studies have shown that if you ask African Americans why they haven't participated in a clinical trial that have a particular disease, their answer is that they've never been asked.
Yeah.
And if you ask individuals that have participated in a clinical trial, that you ask them why they participated, the answer is that their doctor recommended it.
Absolutely.
And so it makes the point around your point around that trust in the primary care. So I love the ideas that have been tossed out around increasing the number of communities of color, where you have more investigators that are trained, that are local for people to connect to. So that's, I think, a wonderful thing and will make a big difference. But I do feel a concern that what we rely on is individual companies deciding to do the right thing, as opposed to regulators who will compel the right thing. And we talk about the stick and the carrot, but there have been certainly episodes or examples of moving companies to do the right thing. We have the pediatric priority review vouchers, we have the pediatric exclusivity. If we were make the commitment to do something that dramatic around enrollment of people of color, particularly in diseases where they are disproportionately impacted, which is almost all of them, and almost all of the cancers, African Americans are disproportionately impacted. Certainly in our area, HIV, African Americans are disproportionately impacted. So if there was a commitment that you have to enroll individuals in your trials that match their representation in the disease area, or there's either a stick, something that you got to do extra, like a post-approval requirement, or a carrot, something that you get for doing it right. So I'd really like the panel to maybe comment on the role the regulators could play.
I love that. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? I will just say it's hard for me not to share this, that I've done lots of studies of trust over the years, and it actually turns out that if you adjust for prior experiences of discrimination, so you actually look and adjust for racism and discrimination, that the group that is the least trusting of American healthcare is white women in the suburbs. And so, the patterns that we see are just fundamentally driven by the experiences that people have had coming into specific areas. So why don't we ask, what should I think, Ariel, you've maybe already put your nickel down, but you want to say what you think the regulator should do, and then I'll ask one other person to comment, whoever would like.
Our take is prevalence of the disease condition should equal the participation of the patients, and if you don't, then your label is shrunk and it won't be applied to all individuals in society. What we have seen over the past 2 years, and we work with hundreds of life science companies, there was 3 needle-moving events in society that's driving the change in investment with these companies. The murder of George Floyd, followed by anything you could watch on the news was about COVID vaccines and representation in those studies, followed by the FDA guidance this past April. I worry, so a congressman told me this once, Congress is good at 2 things, moving too slow or doing nothing. And so, and you generally want them to do nothing, depending on where your politics fall. So I worry about waiting for regulators, to be honest. And I would rather see industry take a step forward like we did with ESG, like Merck did around African American women in pregnancy. And I think the challenge is on us to move first, or we'll wait too long. But if we had to get regulators to do something, it's exactly what you said. We believe in that. The representation of the Asian population should represent who's participated in the clinical study.
I think Kim is your point is what we're spot on. I actually do think that the regulators have a role to play here. I think they do that with the pediatric stuff, right? And I personally think that it's not unreasonable and in fact a helpful tool to do that, because one of the problems with pharma doing it piecemeal is that there's today's problem and then there'll be tomorrow's problem, and the sustainability. The issue for me is about sustainability also, and making sure the attention is maintained. I would tell you that all the pediatric carrots and sticks have been enormously successful, and so I don't see a reason why they can't be the same way. I think that's a terrific idea.
But I have to say that we've had some very productive dialogues with the FDA on some of the clinical studies, starting from the point of the protocol write-up and the statistical analysis plan in terms of inclusion of the DE&I population. And it has worked incredibly well. So the clinical trial diversity focus from a regulatory FDA standpoint is working. But I take the point that it needs to be coming from both sides. The industry partner and the regulator coming to the table to align on what is it we want to see in the study and how are we going to go about executing on that. But there are some good examples already.
We have one question. We have 2 minutes left, so we'll make this, I think what we'll do is make this our last question, and then I hope the panel will be able, if others have come up, and ask your opinion. But why don't we please share as our last question.
Hi, I'm Sue Manber. I'm the Chief Patient Officer at Publicis Health. We've heard a theme all morning about the importance of the community and fueling trust by having clinicians who reflect the community back. Do you think that it is incumbent on industry and this group of people to make more clinical nurses, doctors, and do the training and the scholarships to help people in these communities actually have a path to providing clinical care in the community? So that is my provocation. Is that something that industry should be coming together to
What a
invest
great way to end. I mean, I will say that one of the beauties of all of us is that we've all come up through the system with mentorship, training, education. We all share the people. And so I'd love it maybe on last note, as you all think, I mean, one of the biggest challenges that people always have is getting the talent, right? And so you all in some ways are dependent not only on the talent in your communities and your companies, but you're dependent upon the people in my institution doing the science. You're dependent upon the people and everything. So how do you think about that responsibility? Maybe Maha, I'll go to you first, then Eliav, then.
I think it's a fantastic question, and a simple answer is yes. But if I want to elaborate on that, I would say we all need to start thinking about becoming mentors for the new emerging generation of talents. I know when I was the age of someone coming out of med school, I did not have a mentor who told me this is the path you need to take. I practiced for several years and came into pharma by pure serendipity, and I've loved it because of the impact we make. But I do think that we need to formalize it more. So very happy to say, how do we think together about mentoring programs? How do we partner with the likes of the Morehouse School of Medicine or others that do have this kind of generation of talents, extremely smart individuals coming in, but really don't know what it takes to venture out into a different profession outside of pure clinical practice or medical practice. So I'll stop there, happy to chat over the breaks and happy to contribute in any way in terms of how I can help, with those mentorship programs.
And I will just say, and as we go along, I think the concept of how we build mentorship in science and research, but I think you also called out the point, nursing is so important. And I think if I have one place I could put a nickel for healthcare, we are going to be coming out of this pandemic in desperate need of major investment in our nursing workforce. Eliav, how would you think about this pipeline part of your world?
We're investing all the way down to high school and college, because one of the things is that I've noticed is that we're all chasing the same talent, and there's not. First of all, the numbers are tiny. And it's embarrassing, right? I mean, it's you can't. Anyway, and then the next piece of it is then to go and train fellows, and I think that what BMS is doing is really great. That foundation that BMS is, the monies that they put into it, I think is fantastic, and we've done the same sort of thing as well. So I think that it's going to be a multi-year effort. And again, I think that both nurses, physician's assistants, community workers, social workers as well. And Ken Frazier has also been very much involved in bringing jobs related to healthcare into communities so that people get to start to know about this. And so we've opened up a data management center in North Philadelphia, which is going to be very important and hopefully will grow. So these kind of initiatives, I think, are important to bring people to start to think about, hey, wait a minute, maybe there's something that I can do that's actually me. I can be part of the community and be able to participate in providing health and maybe improving outcomes.
Ariel, I'll go to you, and then Bill, you'll finish us up.
Yeah, so we work with health systems, and to echo what you said, the number one employment shortage in the U.S. are not engineers, they're nurses. Nobody could find enough nurses. Since COVID, they're burnt out, they're on the front lines. It's one of the biggest, as we see the change in aging population in the U.S., it's one of the biggest challenges we're going to face is having enough healthcare workers. I can't say enough about the work that nurses do, the difficult job they have, and the shortage that we're all facing, and we're all going to face and experience from it.
Bill.
I think the last two questions are, we can get you guys together. because there's a congruence here. The industry would love to hire well-trained clinical investigators, nurse investigators from diverse backgrounds. In fact, it's part of our DEI metrics. It's what we have to do. So the ability to identify individuals who are excited about learning this field, I think would be fantastic, because we have literally search firms who we pay a fortune to find these people, and they're not that good at it. But you guys would know, and it would be tremendously helpful for all of us to have access to individuals coming out of college or in nursing school or medical school who would like to participate, especially those from diverse backgrounds. And that's where you would see industry get very, very excited about it.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us here today, and thank the Galien Foundation for really putting this on. I look forward to seeing this all happen.
Very good.
Thank you very much.